your laptop or your desktop. And it goes to some website. And the first thing it does is download and copy a file. It's a giant copying machine. Because the only way you can see something in the net is to copy a file and then display it. And in this particular case, interpret that file and present it. So we have this giant copying machine called the World Wide Web, and it's coming into collision with the notion of controlling copy. So you could say, oh, well, we have to stop the World Wide Web because it's violating everybody's copyright. That's probably not a really practical way to look at this. A more practical way to look at it is to ask ourselves, well, maybe we need to rethink the ways in which intellectual property compensation is accomplished in the presence of this online environment. It's also fair to say that some people who implicitly own intellectual property are not interested in sharing it for monetary gain. And I would base my conclusion on looking at what has happened since the World Wide Web became publicly available, roughly 1994. There has been an avalanche of information flowing into the net, most of it coming from people who simply wanted to share the information in the expectation that it would be useful to someone else. In fact, there's been so much of it flowing into the web since 1994 that companies like Google have been created to help people find the information in this enormous pile of it. So I think that we have to think about copyright as a broader spectrum of choices that the owner of the intellectual property has as to how that information will be shared. So you see experiments like the Creative Commons coming out of Stanford University, Dr. Larry Lessig, and copyleft, which is kind of a joke about copyright and copyleft. They are alternative models for intellectual property and land treatment. And it's my belief that our business, yours and mine, will have to explore a wider range of intellectual property management than we have in the past in order to allow a more flexible choice of sharing of information. I'm sitting here thinking that there may be one other important point about copyright just to mention. If any of you have ever tried to track down who has the rights to a particular work, you may know how hard it is to do that. In the United States, it used to be the case that you had to go to the Copyright Office and submit the work to the Copyright Office in the Library of Congress to establish your rights to that work. But when we adopted the Berne Convention in the United States, we implicitly said you don't have to register the work in order to claim copyright. You implicitly hold it. And for all the other countries that observe the Berne Convention, that's the case. That in itself is not so bad. The problem is that many authors who hold rights in a work, for example, the movie rights of a novel, or the translation rights of a novel, or the performance rights of a musical work, these are various kinds of rights that intellectual property can have, and you can transfer those separately to different parties. The problem is that the transaction that transfers rights is often not recorded in any publicly accessible way. Unlike real estate transactions, which by law in most countries must be recorded, and you can then find the public record for the transfer of property rights, real property rights. But we don't behave that way with intellectual property, and as a result it becomes extremely hard to figure out who is currently holding the rights to a work. So if you've been following the debates about Google's book search, I hope you'll understand that when you get to a place where a work is no longer in print, but it's still valuable and useful, it may be extremely hard to figure out who holds the rights to that work which is no longer in print. While it's in print, it's pretty obvious. There are records called books in print in big, big tomes that tell you who owns the copyright. but after it's out of print, it's not so clear. So Google has been struggling to find a way to legitimately index these works that are out of print so people can find them. And there were arguments over whether we could do that or could not do that. If the work is completely out of copyright, that's a different story, if it's public domain. But the works that are still in copyright and still in print, there's no question who owns those rights. And so Google has negotiated with the publishers of works in print as to terms and conditions for indexing those works. And for works that are no longer in copyright, there's no question that they're public domain and you can index and display those works. It's the ones in between that are the source of all the debate. And I have to remind you, or feel compelled to remind you, that Google's motto is really what we follow. We are trying to organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. And that includes things that are not in print anymore. So we're eager to find a way to help guide people to information that they otherwise might not know about. And so that's what a lot of this debate is about. It's also about figuring out how to compensate someone who ultimately is discovered, who has a right to those works whose rights were unclear at the time. So we propose to establish a fund that can be paid out to people who make claims as to the rights to those works that are out of print. Okay, I'm going to stop there because after a while I'm going to fall asleep, if you haven't already. So I want to turn this around now and ask if you would like to raise issues. Please don't forget that I'm not the only one in this room who might be able to answer questions. That some of you in the room may actually have answers that are better than mine. So let's make this a discussion and not just a Q&A where I'm struggling to answer questions about which I may not have a good answer.